Now, as you undoubtedly have noticed, most of the course has been sort of have a global focus and mostly focused on foreign countries, with a fair amount on Europe and very little actually on America. Now we've come to the part of the course where we're going to discuss social issues, and those are very country dependent. What's a hot social issue depends on the cultural context. And so we're going to use that to do American issues. And with respect to reproduction, there's a couple of main issues. One, which is not quite as hot as it was a decade ago, but it's teen sex and teen pregnancy. Both has a ethical, moral issue and has a practical economic issue about the children of teens, how they're going to get supported and what does it do to poverty of the mother. And you have some really good readings on those. And the other topic which will come next after this is abortion. We're going to spend 2 lectures on that. It's going to be a nice long discussion of that, because that is really the hot topic. So today is teen sexuality and teen pregnancy. And just to start with some data and keep it local, this is from the Hartford Courant, last November 19th, 2008. And there's a national youth risk behavior survey that monitors health risk among high school kids, 9th to 12th graders, all over the United States. So in Connecticut, 42.4% of the kids have had sexual intercourse, of high school kids, and it says 31.8% are sexually active. I don't know exactly what active means, but I guess they're continuing. There's a few percent that didn't like it or something. But there's quite a lot of both one-time early sexuality and then a continuing bout of it. And as part of a problem, that of those that have had or are sexually active, 37.3% reported that they did not use any kind of protection at the last active intercourse, and therefore they're at great risk for pregnancy. And that's just real sexual intercourse, I guess as Bill Clinton defines it. And when you go to oral sex, you get another set of numbers. And oral sex, as you may or may not know, has become the big thing in America. And I'm sure that we don't really know the causes of it. I'm not aware of any real academic literature on that. But the fear of AIDS, there's a perception, which is true, that oral sex is less likely to, not zero likely, but less likely to transmit AIDS. And also because maybe, I don't know how much you were aware of this, but during the Bill Clinton trials, the very conservative prosecutor, Kenneth Starr, was talking about oral sex all the time, and everybody in America learned about it, and then he sort of popularized it. And as is often the case, people that want to push society in this direction end up having pushed it in exactly the opposite direction. So oral sex is alive and well in New Haven, and I sometimes teach teachers how to talk in their classes about the kinds of population issues, the kind of issues we talk about in the class, and they give me a lot of information. So one day I'm talking to these teachers, and they say, "Oh, something interesting has happened in the school." In one of the local high schools, a freshman girl, not an older girl, freshman girl was caught in the stairwell providing oral sex for a line of boys. They were standing there waiting, a few of them with their pants down, and this girl was doing them one after the other. This is a freshman in the local high school. The New Haven Register has a headline, "Teens Turn to Oral Sex." 10th grade students, so that's high school sophomores, 40% of the boys and girls reported that they had engaged in oral sex in the last year, and about 25% that they had 3 or more different oral sex partners in the previous year. So sex among teenagers is alive and well, as they say. Now, here's your anecdote for today. A teenager, so Hartford, as you know, is a very bad, got a lot of poor people in Hartford, let's just put it that way. And Planned Parenthood has set up a clinic in the northeast part of Hartford, a very poor part of Hartford. And this is from one of the counselors there. A teenage girl comes into the Planned Parenthood clinic there and says, "I'm pregnant." And the counselor says, "Oh, how do you know that?" And she says, "Oh, I not only know that, I know exactly when I got pregnant." "Oh? Well, I know that if your boyfriend comes only once, you can't get pregnant. But on such and such a day," and she named the date, "we did it twice, and I allowed him to come the second time. And that's when I got pregnant. I know that's when I got pregnant." Because she was of the belief that one time can do it, but two times will. Well, they took the test, and indeed she was, yes? Yeah, okay. Indeed, she took the test, and indeed she was pregnant, but she had been pregnant like 2 months before she thought she was, telling him that she had it completely wrong.
My mother worked in the National Health Service Corps in the 70s.
Shout.
My mother worked in the National Health Service Corps in the 70s in rural Colorado, and she had a 12-year-old come in who was in labor. She didn't know that she was pregnant at the time.
Did not, yeah. So that's, I don't know that you heard all that. Her mother worked in Colorado, and a 12-year-old came in labor, and she didn't even know she was pregnant. So that's the story of Colorado, Hartford. It's all around. In 1999, which is sort of the peak of this concern about teenage pregnancy, 450 Hartford teenagers gave birth. How many completed high school? 332 girls graduated from Hartford City Schools in that same year. So 1/3 more girls became mothers than graduated from high school. You can imagine this was considered a serious problem. Now, what is the social, the political, the social, the school response to this problem? Well, they're kind of hamstrung. And a nurse practitioner at a Hartford school clinic said that she's allowed to test and treat students for sexually transmitted diseases, but she can do nothing about the possibility of pregnancy. She may not prescribe birth control or even distribute condoms in the school. And there was a proposal in the city council to allow the schools to distribute condoms, and it was roundly turned down. And what is the political concern here? The political concern is what you can see here, that people who are opposed to providing contraception for teenagers, and including politicians, this is an advocacy ad. This is not an academic sort of thing, but this is actually true, that people believe that even discussing sex will tend to encourage it, and certainly handing out birth control will facilitate teenagers having sex. So this is the political, this is the opinion, the kind of attitude that is opposed to it, and why the Hartford school system and many other school systems can't provide contraception. So, of course, this gets discussed a lot, and it's a topic of discussion not only for the parents, but for the teenagers. And one nice quote from Maritza Lopez, who's a Hartford Public School high school junior, and she was already a mother. And she dismissed this idea, saying, "All the girls I know are sexually active. Most started in the 6th or 7th grade. They're going to do it no matter what." Now, I experienced this same kind of attitude. I was again teaching the teachers, sort of teacher training kind of stuff, and I was new at it, and I was a little naive. This was Connecticut teachers all over the state. And before I started, I said, "Look, we're going to discuss some pretty heavy stuff here, involving sex and everything, and I don't know how much of this you can talk to your kids about." They roared with laughter. And what they all told me was, all of our kids, they exaggerated, I'm sure it wasn't all, but the way they expressed it was, all of our kids are into sex already. I can say anything that I want. There's nothing that they're going to be some some schools can do a decent, proper sex education, and some schools are not allowed to do proper sex education. And the problem with, even in the schools where it's allowed, is that it's often the choice of teachers. It can be the health ed teacher or something, who may be a jock, that has said, okay, it's your job to teach sex education. It's rarely that a teacher gets to volunteer, that they survey all the teachers and say, this is a tough job, who wants to do it? No, somebody gets assigned to do that. And then you get that very often the teacher herself may not approve of sex education for the children. She may think it's not a proper topic for a school, for whatever grade she's supposed to teach it in. She may, and I say she, it may be she or he, the teacher may be uncomfortable talking about sex, may not be well educated on how to handle questions about sex or about contraception, may also very likely now be afraid of legal complications or disciplinary actions from the school if they handle it wrong and they say the wrong thing. And parents start objecting, which certainly happens, and it happens in Connecticut, and I've been involved in some of that stuff. Parents coming in and screaming and yelling at them or threatening to sue the teacher happens. In any case, most sex education teachers, as far as one has data, which is very skinny, the teaching of this subject is just not coming from a person's guts. They're fulfilling a curriculum assignment. It's something that they're assigned to do. And if in something of this nature, the teacher is not really, this is not coming from her soul, then it's a guarantee for an unsuccessful program. And we've seen things like this before. Remember when we talked about the family planning program in Pakistan and Bangladesh? They started with the dais when it was one country, when it was Pakistan. And the dais were the traditional birth attendants who themselves were not using contraception, didn't believe in it, didn't know anything about it, and could make more money attending births. So the program was a complete failure until they changed and started hiring women who themselves were using contraception and several high status and really approved of it. And then the program became a great success. So you have to have consistency. If you make a law or try to have a policy, the people that are supposed to carry out the policy must want to do that. If they don't really want to do that, whatever your policy is in any area of activity, it's not going to work. Okay, now this doesn't mean that it's necessarily terribly difficult to be effective with sex education. Planned Parenthood, for instance, I use them as an example because I know about them. They do a lot of sex education for the schools, and often when the school is uncomfortable doing it or doesn't have anybody that they think wants to do it or is qualified to do it, they will call in Planned Parenthood or one of a number of other kinds of organizations. And Planned Parenthood has flexibility to hire people, they don't have licensing and so forth requirement, who are really committed to this kind of thing. So they did what they call a seminar for high school students, again in Connecticut here, I think it was also Hartford, and they got a letter back from one of the students. Hello, my name is Kelly and I was in your seminar. I would like to thank you for making me aware of some of the consequences of sex. Because of your seminar, I got the courage to ask my mother for birth control before something happened that I would regret for the rest of my life. I also got the courage to ask my boyfriend to use a condom instead of nothing. Thank you so much. You've really honestly changed my life. I guess when the info doesn't come from the teacher, it actually hits home. Thank you, Kelly. Now this is a teenager's letter, and it's one anecdote, so you can't make an awful lot out of it. But you have to think a little bit. She says, making me aware of some of the consequences of sex. Well, you know, do you think she really didn't know that you get pregnant from sex so that you can get diseases? No, she all knew that she had misidentified what was going on. I doubt, I'd be flabbergasted if she didn't know that by the time she's in high school. What do you think? You were more recently in high school. Don't all the kids know that you get pregnant from sex? Yes. Yes, and all know that you can get a disease, an STD from sex? I'm not so sure. All right, maybe Kelly wasn't. Maybe I'm wrong and Kelly was right. I don't know. But the thing is, it's all the way it's presented. It's presented by someone that really cares about it and wants to do it. There's just a whole different atmosphere, and kids' minds open up to this kind of thing. Anyway, America is generally in a mess with respect to sex education and sex in generally. And it's quite different than European countries. So here is a typical graph that is presented frequently. And this shows the number of children born to teenagers. This was, again, at the peak of the problem. And here's France, here's Germany, here's Japan, here's Great Britain, and whoops, here's the United States.
Is there a graph suggested for population size?
Ah, perfect. That was the next question, and I'm glad one of you caught it right away. This is again, usually presented like this. It's an advocacy thing. It wants to scare you. It wants to show you how much worse the United States is than everybody else. But as we just got told, the United States has a much larger population than any of these places, so this is not really a legitimate way of presenting the data. So of course your dutiful teacher redid it, and here is when you divide out by population, and you see it's not as severe as the illegitimate graph, but it's still, the United States is still has more than twice the percentage problem. Anyway, it's still serious. So in fact, they didn't have to use the improper data. They could have used data like this, and still the problem becomes very clear. So from a lot of studies of these kind of things, it turns out countries that have a very liberal attitude towards sexuality have the lowest teen birth rates, teen pregnancy rates, and a place like Netherlands, probably in the West, I don't know, either Denmark or Sweden or Netherlands is probably the most liberal. And in those countries, it's considered a perfectly normal part of teenage experience. And the teenagers are expected and encouraged to bring their girlfriend or boyfriend home and sleep in the same room. That is maybe starting to happen in America. I don't know, how many of your parents would allow that? Oh, a few, right? She's married. Okay, so in the Netherlands, the US rate is 54 per 1,000 teens, about 1 out of 20 each year. And Netherlands, the figure is 7, so 8 times lower. It's a huge difference depending on the country attitude. So in academically discussing this, things get terribly mixed up. There is a bunch of issues which usually people don't separate out. One is teen pregnancy, and that's very different than can be different than teen childbearing, because not all those pregnancies come to birth. There's teen sex. When you have sex, you might get pregnant, and if you get pregnant, you might actually have a live birth. So there's 3 different steps, and when you're looking at statistics, you have to separate those. And another is the whole idea of out-of-wedlock births, that births born to mothers that are not married, and then you can combine, or pregnancies, you can combine those two, so to out-of-wedlock teen pregnancies. And when you read discussions of this, try to figure out which of these problems they're talking about. It's often not made very clear, but it's very important to keep it straight, and I'll try to talk about these different things and make it clear. So when you discuss this, so one issue is what are the statistics you're looking at, refer to, and I hope I've always been clear in these slides. The other, when you go cross-nationally, like to other countries, and it's not always clear what marriage means. In other culture, in the West, in general, the United States in particular, a marriage is a legal statement. And it's an all or nothing sort of thing. You either have a marriage certificate and you are married, or you don't have a marriage certificate and you're not married. And if you have one and you get divorced, then you, in principle, don't have one anymore. It's an on or off kind of thing. Everyone really knows whether they are married or they are not married. In other cultures, marriage is quite variable. It's a staged thing, and it may have various steps in the marriage. So for instance, in Nigeria, among the Fulani, at circumcision, a boy who's aged 7 to 10 at this time is then betrothed to an infant girl. And sometimes betrothed is translated as married. too. When the when the future husband, but they don't live together. When the future husband's father learns from the girl's parents, who are living separately, that she has begun menstruation and then is believed to be capable of childbirth, the girl then moves into her husband's, her future husband's compound. So they're still betrothed. She's now menstruating, so she moves in with the husband. It's still the future husband. And she's treated as a daughter of the husband's father's household. She's treated like a sister of the boy. The boy and girl sleep together. They have sex in the open. And the boy is usually, in this culture, it's a herding culture. They sleep outside near the corral to guard the cattle against raiders and wolves and whatever kind of predator animals they have there. And this all done, of course, very openly. But they still have the status of an unmarried youth and a maiden. The word is a maiden. She's not a virgin anymore, but she's a maiden. When the girl becomes pregnant, she moves back to her father's household. And she stays there for 3 wet seasons, and they have wet and dry seasons there, so it's a geological, climatological thing. And that takes 2 to 2.5 years, depending on when they've started. And then she returns to the boy, and only then are they considered married. So there's so many different steps, and then they're officially married. And so using our definition of marriage, applying to the Fulani, since they always have that first child, and until it's 2 or 3, when they're not married, basically all Fulani first births are illegitimate births by our counting of it. Among the Dogon people, which is Mali and Burkina Faso, a girl doesn't move into her spouse's home until the birth of the 2nd or even the 3rd child. Speaking of that, in Sweden, I lived in Sweden, and we have a guest whose son is in Sweden. When I was there, the tradition was building up that you get married on the birth of your 2nd child. Is that still happening, or you?
No, they actually got married before the first.
Her own son, but that's because he's a foreigner. In China, they have an interesting system in the old days, in some places, that I don't think I described, where they have child marriage, and they marry a boy to an older girl. And the older girl then acts as a kind of nanny and takes care of the boy until they grow up. But they're legally married, but he's 5 years old or something, and she takes care of them until she's a surrogate mother until he becomes sexually mature. And one of the explanations for the low rate of Chinese fertility within marriage is that boys rarely have sexual interest in their sisters, at least not for long. And so this kid grows up, and this older girl has been taking care of him, and by the time they get married, there's no sexual interest hardly at all, so the rate of intercourse is very low, and the birth rate is very low. And we talked quite a bit about that. Also in traditional China, that men can take many wives, and men can take concubines, and they can take slaves. And the distinction among all these categories is not very clear, since marriage is usually not a government function, but they go to the local Buddhist shrine and do a variety, or Taoist shrine, and do a variety of different practices depending on the women. One of the most common ways, so the marriage, there will be often a first wife, not necessarily the first woman that's taken into the household for the sexual relations with the husband, but what's called the first wife, and she will be prominent. And then there will be all kinds, depending on how rich the person is, a variety of other women. And apparently, one of the frequent things is that the degree of importance of the marriage depends on how public the ceremony was. If there's a big public ceremony with lots of relatives and neighbors invited, then it's very clear this is what we would call a marriage. Other cases, a woman is just taken in the middle of the night and brought in the house, and there's never anything public done whatsoever, and she lives there as a sexual partner for the husband, and you can call it married or call it not married. She lives in the house probably till she dies with that. So this marriage, again, is not an all or nothing kind of thing. It will start out with different levels of status, and then during the course of the marriage, the status can change. The husband may become enamored of the wife and will in various ways raise her status or degrade her status, and so forth. Now, in poor communities, everywhere you read about this in Brazil, among poor people in the United States, formal marriage is sort of almost disappeared, and it's replaced by various informal unions. And these informal unions, where there's no legal status whatsoever, the word marriage is just not used, the state of the relationship between the man and the woman is sort of negotiated daily. I mean, it can change all the time. That it's not, again, not a fixed thing, but a very floating kind of relationship. Even in the United States, of course, marriage is not a uniform legal situation. Each marriage is a state law. It's not a federal. You don't get married in a federal situation. You get married in a state situation. So there's 50 different situations altogether. Then we have prenuptial agreements, which arrange the financial relationship between the man and his wife, or vice versa. And so that can be different. In other places, even more issues than just financial are arranged by private contract. It's not set by law, but by private contract between the marrying parties, or more likely between the marrying families. And so a friend of mine, daughter went to college in Egypt, went to the American University in Cairo. I was going to say fell in love with an Egyptian guy. I don't know. They had sex. I don't know whether they fell in love or not. But she got pregnant, and the girl decided to get married. The parents were divorced, and the girl's father wanted to have nothing to do with it. So there was the mother had to do something about it. And she was opposed to the marriage, but the girl didn't listen. So they were going to go ahead with the marriage. Now, in Egypt at that time, you have to have a marriage contract. And that specifies all kinds of rights that the woman has. What rights does she have in her children? Without that specified marriage contract, they're totally the husband. There's any divorce or anything, the husband gets them. There's no legal case whatsoever. What are her rights to travel? Can she travel by herself? Can she go abroad? Can she travel around Egypt by herself? What are her rights to residence? What are her rights to child custody, and so forth? So all this had to be specified, and there was no husband to do it. So guess who played I played the role of the father and helped negotiate this thing. Very interesting. And so each marriage means something different in many places. And you can see that in the DHS surveys, the demographic and health surveys that I've shown you, it never uses the word marriage. It says in union, that because marriage sort of means so many different things, or means nothing at all. Now, it's often perceived that teenage pregnancy and related social problems are from graphs like that, are either uniquely American or more extreme in America, but it's not the case. For instance, in Japan, of women who were teenagers at their first birth, 82% became pregnant before marrying. Of women aged 20 to 24, 58% became pregnant before marrying. And of all women, 26% became pregnant before marrying. In other words, if a Japanese woman got pregnant before her late 20s, she was probably unmarried at the time that she got pregnant. And these numbers are, are numbers that have live births. And as you'll see in the next lecture, Japan has an extremely high rate of abortion. So these numbers are these are the women who carry the birth to term, and probably at least these are underestimates by a factor of 2, because this doesn't take into account abortion. So I've assigned you reading that discusses this issue from a whole variety of perspectives. And I guess I don't have to tell you what it is, because you'll do the reading. So a little bit of the biological background to these issues. And some of this I don't have to tell you about, because you were teenagers yourself very recently. So several things happen at puberty, and there are tremendous physical changes. You've noticed this. There are tremendous physiological changes. I'm sure you've noticed that. And there are even tremendous emotional changes, which of course you guys wouldn't know anything about because you've been studying too hard to pay any attention to this. So evolution has clearly designed to have this incredible eruption of the ability to get infatuated, to fall in love, to have sexual emotions, and it all comes on like a ton of bricks at puberty. This is not by chance, this is not by culture, this is straight old mother evolution doing these things to you. And simultaneously with this, especially on males, there's an eruption, but it's not absent in females, a great eruption of revolt against parental authority. You know, you're a little kid, you do whatever mommy says, more or less. When you're a teenager, no go. There's competitiveness, there's aggressiveness, there's violence onsets at puberty, and all of this is to set a place in the dominance hierarchy. And of course, we are in the West well aware of these incredible emotional outbursts, and there's tons of literature about this, of which probably the most famous is Romeo and Juliet. So anybody take a Shakespeare class? How old are Romeo and Juliet supposed to be? 13, 14, something like that. And what did their great overpowering love cause them to do? They killed themselves over it, very purposely. They could not live without the other, with their partner. So this emotion is extraordinarily strong, even stronger than the desire to have life. Now, adolescent sexuality is more or less disruptive depending a lot on the culture, and probably the one most important variable is how much teen sexuality is allowed. Does one have an outlet for these emotions? If the culture allows an outlet in one variety of ways, then it's probably easier for the adolescent to accommodate this. If, like our culture in principle, we're not supposed to have an outlet for this, then the tensions build up and strange things happen. So different societies handle adolescent sexuality very different. You read the Amgad story about the Egyptian woman, and that is one way in which traditional societies handle sex. And you remember that her sexual initiation began very early. It began before puberty, if you remember that. It was introduced with what she perceived to be a fair amount of violence. Remember, on her wedding night, she had no clue what was going on, and the women come and investigate her before the marriage ceremony, and it must be an extremely scary business. And even before that, the women in Egypt, all those, well, that was only one woman you read about, they all had clitorectomies, which again, you read out there. So there's a lot of violence involved in teenage sexuality in a lot of places. And it's moderately common, at least in traditional times, that marriage and first intercourse precedes puberty. In Iran, for instance, a few years ago, Iran raised the legal age of marriage to the age of 9. I may have mentioned this in a previous lecture. And the conservatives were very upset about this, and they were opposed to this because they considered that raising of the marriage age would be much too liberal for Iranian society. And the reason that they chose the age of 9 was that Muhammad married his favorite wife, his second wife, Aisha, when she was 9. But again warn you that getting married doesn't necessarily mean the onset of sexual intercourse. You don't have any idea what happened there, but getting married, like the 5-year-old boys in China getting married, does not, you don't know what that means with respect to sex, just that a contract has been decided upon. And at some stage, sex will take place between the two. So with respect to this bill, Parliament actually passed it. Oh, later on, yeah, they did raise it to 9, and then a further bill came in to raise the age from 9 to 13. But that was blocked by the Guardian Council, which is the conservative religious body. And they thought that since Muhammad got married at 9, that you couldn't do anything different than that. Now, in many parts of the world, until very recently, if a girl got into her late teens or certainly early 20s without being married, it was considered a disaster. That then she was, by 20, much too old, and she would never get married. She would be a spinster for the rest of her life. And so these cultures had, most traditional cultures have various proscriptions against premarital sex, sex before marriage, and this has several very important functions. One is to ensure the paternity. If you're married and you're pregnant, the society can be pretty sure of, or at least can assume legally, that the father, that they know the father. And therefore the economic responsibility for the child is very clear. That's one of the reasons to have a fixed legal status of marriage. And back then, marriage and puberty were essentially the same. Prepubescent girls were all post-pubescent girls. They got married at puberty and that's it. So a lot of these languages don't have words that distinguish between maiden in the sense of a young girl and virgin in the sense of a girl who's not had sex. And there's a large theological discussion in the Bible when, you know, Virgin Mary, was she a maiden or a virgin? And the language maybe doesn't distinguish between these two kinds of things. Another prohibition against premarital sex, since puberty and marriage were often very tightly tied, that the prohibition against premarital sex was really intended in many cases to protect girls from prepubertal sex. So what had originally that goal, deal with prepubertal sex, if you retain the legal aspect of it till the women are much later, it doesn't anymore have that kind of function whatsoever. So teenage childbearing was very common. Illegitimacy was very common. So the earliest records we have are from the 1600s and the Chesapeake Bay colony. And way back then, guess what fraction of women were pregnant when they got married? Of married women, what fraction were pregnant? Make a guess, 1600s, Chesapeake Bay colony. 85%. What? 85%. 30%, which is very much similar to the numbers that we've had until recently. It just seems to be almost a constant. And they have fairly decent records through American history and a lot of other histories, and the rates of premarital pregnancy seem to go up and down, and there seem to be large increases in the late 1600s and around 1725, two of the earliest booms of premarital pregnancy, and I don't have any idea what the cause of those are, but you can go to our professor of colonial history and try to find out. So why were these not a social problem, these premarital pregnancies? Because what happened then? They got married. And those kind of marriages are called shotgun weddings. Now, have you all not heard that word, shotgun weddings? You get pregnant first, then in principle, the image comes from the girl's father carrying a shotgun, say, "You're going to marry my daughter, aren't you?" But those are standardly called shotgun weddings. And I think I've mentioned to you that if the mother didn't get married, either because of her unwillingness or the guy's unwillingness, then she had a real problem because, as I said, in the Anglo-American tradition, it was not the family that had responsibility, the village had responsibility for the unwed child, to both the mother and the child. It had to support it, and for all these villages living on the edge of subsistence, this was a very big burden. So I think I mentioned this, the stories of pregnant women being chased from village to village so that they would not have the child in the village, because then ever thereafter that child is the responsibility of the village. Another thing to keep in mind, that we talk now a lot about single parent families and what a bad problem this is. It turns out that the prevalence of single parent families has always been very high. So in the 1700s, for instance, this is a quote from a history book, "One of the main characteristics of European urban households in the 18th century was the large proportion that were headed by women. In Reims, under the Ancien regime, in France before the French Revolution, 1 out of 4 homes were headed by women, and 15 to 25% in all the towns for which they have data in this. And in the US, the prevalence, so the big divorce boom came after the 50s in America, but it turns out that the prevalence of single-parent households at the end of the 20th century was almost identical to that at the beginning of the 20th century. But what was the difference? At the end of the century, single-parent households were caused by either lack of marriage or divorce. But at the beginning of the century, death of one of the parents. So what has happened is that marriages, on average, didn't last very long in traditional time because one of the parents would die. The death rates were so high. So they coped with single parent families because of death. And now people psychologically apparently are not attuned to staying together for long times or even getting married in the first place. So now that situation has changed so that now it's sort of voluntary single parent families. But the numbers surprisingly have changed very little bit. Okay, so it's another one of these things that I've talked about in history where things change from being outside of human control, like whether you're married or not, whether you're going to be a single parent. Outside of human control is brought into human control. It's in some sense under human choice. So what has changed in the modern West with respect to all this, and is now spreading everywhere, is that children are not supposed to get married as teenagers. Probably if you had gotten married in high school, probably every single one of your parents would have really been very upset by that. Of course, in the old, the essence has to do with education. Then in the old days, you were a peasant, you were a farmer, and things were done the way they had always been done, and little kids starting at age 5, 6, 7 started going into the fields with his mother or his father or both of them, and watching how the farming is done. And by the time he was a teenager, he'd probably learned how you do things, because it's done traditionally. There was no science to it. There was no quantification, no arithmetic involvement. This is the way you do things. When the moon is at such and such a phase, after this, you start planting and so forth, and so on, and you learn all that. And so there was no need no economic need to have a lot of education. Now, of course, that's turned around completely. Even farmers definitely do not do things in a traditional manner. It requires a lot of education to be a very efficient farmer. And so we need a lot of schooling for whatever we do. And so we're not supposed to get married until our schooling is finished. And your parents would not only have been mortified if you got married in high school, but they probably would be mortified if you got married before you graduated college. How many of you think your parents would be very happy if you got married now? Now, how many of you are married? 1. No, 2, sorry. 2 of the TAs are married, and the TAs are moderately married. So, and now, mostly I teach biology majors, and we all know when do biology majors grow up. Is it when they get their MD? Or is it when they finish their residency? That's the big issue, and they generally don't get married before that. Okay, now we have to do a little quantification of all of this. So here is the crux of the problem, and this is in 1890. So menarche, of course, is the onset of the menses, and presumably more or less the time of beginning of fertility, and that was at about 15 years of age. Now, with presumably increased nutrition, although the reasons are still somewhat questionable, the age of menarche is now 12 and a half. So this period has been extended forward. The age at marriage was 22 in 1890, the average age of marriage for women. This is for women. And so the period was still fairly between the onset, presumably, of sexual desire and quote, legitimate realization of it at marriage was about 7.5 years, and then very rapidly a first birth would occur. Now what happens as you go to 1988, menarche becomes earlier, and marriage becomes a lot later. And now both these things have expanded even more. So that now the period of time between the onset of adolescence and sexual desires and marriage becomes longer, and as time goes on, this gets longer and longer. And it's the same story for men. We don't have good early data on the spermarchy, but marriage is even later than for women. So for men, it's 12.5 years. That's a very long period of time in the life cycle of a man, especially, not much less for a woman. And especially during the fertile years, say 15 to 40, like 25 fertile years, this is, or 35, this is half or somewhat less than half of your total fertile period is pre-marital here. So quantitatively, that's probably where the social issue comes up. Way before 1890s, in traditional societies, menarche and marriage come at the same time. There's no real interval there. So there's not a social problem of what to, the social problem is what to do with sexuality in this interval here. That in traditional times, when our religions grew up and most of our cultural presuppositions grew up, there was no period, or extremely little period, between the onset of adolescence and marriage. As time goes on and the need for education increases, that period between onset of adolescence and marriage grows longer and longer. And there becomes this very long social period in which by some social conventions you're not supposed to have sex, or the child is still a child in a sense, not supposed to have sex, but the biology is telling them that yes, they want it very much. And societies have had, Western societies especially, but the rest of the world is not any different, have had a lot of trouble and are still in the middle of having difficulty with deciding what to do with this period. What is the morals, what are the ethics, what's the religious attitudes that should take place about sexuality in these periods. And this whole lecture basically is this whole problem of teenage sexuality is due to that problem there. Okay. Now, so if you look at the time, what has happened? What has happened to sexuality in this period? Well, what do you think has happened to the frequency of sex among teenagers, unmarried teenagers or teenagers? Up. Well, yep, that is correct. Here's data. So this data is not clear. You'd want to bring the data more up to date, but we just don't have it. But here's women starting in 1956. After World War II, there was a very conservative period in America where the war was very disruptive. They had the big depression in the war, and people wanted to go back to a traditional way of living. A little white house in the suburbs with a man and wife and a white picket fence around it. And the fraction of teenage women, this is teenagers, having sex was like still a quarter, more than a quarter. So it was not zero by any means. And then as time goes on, it goes higher and higher. And now it's sort of double the rate. Not now, this is 1980, late 80s. So we've progressed another 20, 30 years since then, and it's just continued to creep up. This is for females, and this is for males, showing the same thing. So yes, indeed, sex has increased, no question about that. But what do you think has happened to the teen birth rate? This is really what people don't realize, is that during that same period where the frequency of teen sex was rising quite noticeably, the teen birth rate went from 80 or even 90 in the middle 50s, during where that other graph started, in the middle of this conservative period. There's a very high teen birth rate, and then it's gone down and it's continued on down. It's now down at about this level, about 40 currently. But these graphs were all done during this period of peak. It's being a peak as a social issue. This bump here where it raised temporarily, was significant. You're going from 50 to 60 or something, which is a 20% increase in teen births. So no one really knows what that is, but sort of the presumption it was the Reagan and Bush just say no period, where social programs to combat pregnancy, largely sex education, were frowned upon, were put down, and the result was an increase. That's very conjectural. We really don't have any way of finding out what caused that. But since that's over, it's come back down and continued to fall. Every year, basically, the rate of teen pregnancy gets less than the previous year. But it's still a big problem. Of course, I showed you in the first grade, there's still about 500,000 teenage pregnancies each year. And that is, in the American context, about half what it used to be. But in the world, it's middling. It's more than in Europe and less than in a lot of other countries. So if you break this down, this decline in teen childbearing, you can average it out. It's 1% a year, kind of continually since the 1950s. So the last 50 years, teenage pregnancy has dropped on average 1% a year, very, very consistently. And you can break it down. It's dropped in all 50 states. If you break it down geographically, it's dropped all ethnic groups. You pick your ethnic groups. The teen pregnancy has fallen. And the drop in, especially during the peak of the crisis, there was a special worry about poor teenagers, and that time meant mostly black teenagers, and the rate of drop of teen pregnancy among black teenagers has been about twice the rate of drop among whites. So they've come much closer together. And it's not only childbearing, but actual pregnancy rates. If this is childbearing rates, if I put up pregnancy rates, it would look pretty much the same. Okay, now we got a problem here. So we've said that the rate of teen pregnancy, something like doubled, and the rate of teen sexuality somewhat doubled, yet the rate of teen childbirth went in half. So there's a factor of 4 that we have to explain here, right? That what we think should have doubled, in fact, went down by a factor of 2. So what is the factor here? Oh no, what did teens start to do? What?
Married one.
They what?
Married.
No, marriage. I'll show you marriage in a minute. In fact, I will show you marriage. Okay, good. That's a good point. This is the marriage rates for different ages, and here is women in the prime age of marriage. This is marriage rate. 1960, marriage disappears. Marriage falls off the face of the cliff. What? I'm sorry. Birth rate. Yes, sorry, my mistake. The birth rate drops. Yeah, sorry. The birth rate drops tremendously. And what happens in the early 60s to cause that? The pill, the birth control pill. So this is a pure technological effect. And this kind of drop, we've seen this for China, and when Mexico legalized contraception, you get these drops. This is 15 years. It goes from 250 down to less than 125. It drops by a factor of 2 in 15 years. Enormous drop. And this is all a technological drop due to the availability of modern contraception, and the pill in particular. And we've seen that that means that at this point in time, when the birth rate was 1 out of every 4 women every year of fertile ages, that's a pretty high rate. That means that, the other social indicators don't change so much, like the economy or the amount of female education or anything like that, not so rapidly. So this means that at that time there must have been a fairly large desire to stop childbearing, but there wasn't the technology available. And so as soon as the technology is available, boom, the birth rate drops. Now, for teenagers, here's age 15 to 19, you also get a drop, also at the same time of onset, but it's much more gradual. And why is that? That's...
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you a question. Have you factored into this the legalization of abortion which took place?
The legalization of abortion is probably this blip down here. 73. No, that's later. That was 73, so that's down here. The fertility drop is 60. Contraception gets legalized in 65 and abortion in 73. So it's too late for that. But the availability of contraception and the legalization of it. So in 1960, contraception between married people was not legal. And it was in 1965, sort of partway through this drop, that it became legal. But it was used very heavily. There was, as in China with the one-child policy, there was just rampant ignoring of the law. It was the Supreme Court case that was a Connecticut case. The Planned Parenthood of Connecticut did the contraception law, did the case that made contraception legal for married people. And it was later that unmarried people got the right to have contraception. So the birth rate drops for married women, but for teenagers it drops much more slowly, and that's the trade-off between that they're having more sex, so you expect it to go up, but they're using contraception, so it's going down. Whereas these women, married women at that age, were having sex before this period, so what you see is all a contraceptive effect, and there's no increase in sexual frequency to counterbalance that. So this is what you would expect. This is the full contraceptive effect. This is the contraceptive effect minus the increased sexuality effect. So, and we know that something like 3/4 of sexually active teenagers, and this for a long time, use contraception, and they're amazingly not good. They're not dumb about it at all. They in general use contraception at least as effectively as adults, and in several of the studies they use contraception more effectively than adults. And so if contraception hadn't come in at that time, you would have seen a tremendous rise in teen pregnancy and teen births, whereas in fact you saw a gentle, 1% a year, a gentle drop in teen births. Cross-national studies show quite convincingly that the drop, that the moderation, that this drop, that why teen pregnancy didn't rise when teen sex rose, was due to contraception. So in Canada, US, Sweden, France, Great Britain, the age of sexual debut doesn't change very much when you go across these countries. About 40% of the 15 to 17-year-olds have already had intercourse, and this rises to 70 to 80% among 18 to 19-year-olds. In fact, the US had a significantly lower percentage of girls who had intercourse in the past 3 months than at the year this was taken, say 59% in the US and 79% in Sweden. So we had less sexuality in the other countries. And even though we had a lower amount of sexual activity, the teen pregnancy rate, the teen birth rate, the teen sexually transmitted disease rates were much higher. And again, if you compare the use of contraception in Europe, it's much better than here, and that explains all these problems with this sexuality. Non-use of contraception in the United States was 5 times as great as that of Great Britain and 3 times as great as that in Sweden. The effect is not concentrated in lower economic groups. That's a somewhat interesting fact, because almost everything else breaks out by economic groups. Contraceptive use among teenagers doesn't vary that much among different economic groups. Okay. Now, so what's the problem here? So we start out that there was, or still appeared to be, a huge problem with teen pregnancy, but we see that in actual fact the data contradicts that teen pregnancy has been declining rather steadily, 1% a year for the last 50 years, and now half of what it used to be. But there's a whole section we can discuss teenage abortion rates, but what has happened is the disappearance of shotgun weddings. So this data is premaritally pregnant women. This is a somewhat wider age range, not teenagers, but 15 to 29. And what fraction of them got married before the birth of their first child? So they're pregnant before this graph happens. Sometime later, they may or may not get married. What fraction of them get married before the birth of their child? They're pregnant, the child's born. Do they get married in between? Traditional shotgun wedding. And here, oh no. Well, you can, there it is. It's getting bad. You can see it was fairly stable for many years, and then boom, it just falls off. That's white women. Here's here's total women you can see, Hispanic and black women. What disappears, it's not an issue with sexual activity, it's an issue with marriage. That the problem is that marriage drops much faster than the teenagers or anybody else can cope with. And so what happens, and here is the source of the problem, that even though the teen birth rate during this period is declining, the non-marital teen birth rate is rising. And that's one of the things that people always don't distinguish between. And it was this, the non-marital teen birth rate, that was making the real social issue. It was not the total birth rate, but the unmarried birth rate. And this was enough of a social problem, but without the teen use of contraception, the problem, remember, we thought we should have seen a doubling of teen pregnancy, and we saw a halving, cutting in half. So there's a factor of 4 difference. This would have risen 4 times as fast without teenage use of contraception. And again, we started with, one of the big social issues of should teens be given contraception. And I think the data here shows that, don't make any kind of moral statement or ethical statement, but that if they don't have it, non-marital teen birth rate is going to be fantastic. A question? Somebody, I thought, raised their hand. No. Okay. Now, you have the reading. There's all kinds of programs that are supposed to do something about teen pregnancy, and you'll read about this. One of these virginity pledges, the abstinence-only programs, various conservative measures, and there's now good studies of all of these, and none of them work. And the information on that is in your reading. Okay, so here's the story on that with this drop in marriage, and this is all women, it's not just teenagers. Look at the rise in unmarried births, and it's about 1/3 of all births are to unmarried women of all ages, and that's continued on the slow rise since then. So this is kind of a huge sea change in American childbearing practices. It's going from almost always within marriage to a very large fraction outside of marriage. And here, so this is the birth rate. So mostly like older women, it's rising. Over 40, it's low, but it's rising. 35, 39, it's rising. 30 to 34, slightly rising. 25 to 29, little bit rising. And the only group that's having a lower birth rate are the 15 to 19-year-olds. That you can see that their line is definitely sloping down. So this marriage problem, this is the change in birth rates, and the only one that's having a smaller birth rate are the teenagers. And this is now the unmarried birth rate. And here you see, again, 35 to 39-year-old women very much increased. Again, the 30 to 34, the different ages, all the ages of women have an increasing rate of unmarried birth rate, except the teenagers. Here's the 15 to 17-year-olds. They are falling down. And here this dark blue line is 18 to 19-year-olds. So whether it's 15 to 19, that's the only group in America in which unwed childbearing is going down.
Is this a percentage, or is this a proportion, or total number?
Rate per thousand. I don't know if you can see this. Rate per thousand. So 10 per thousand, 20 per thousand, 40 per thousand. Okay. Yeah.
Do you know if the programs from 15 to 18-year-olds is successful at all, or is it?
No, the data has been, most of the programs work on younger kids, and yeah.
Is that why it's not going up as much as the others?
That is in debate. No, the abstinence programs, no. There's two sets of programs competing. One are abstinence type programs, virginity pledges of work, and the other is sex education programs. And you have to have a very good study to figure out what's going on for any particular group of students. And I put in your reading packet some of the best studies of this. Here's another interesting sort of factor, that if you break teenage birth rates out by state in America, the red states have the 10 highest rates, and they are the South Belt here. So the most conservative and the ones with the lowest 10 rates, it's New England, New Jersey, Upper Midwest. The most conservative and the most religious parts of America are the ones that have the highest teen birth rate. But again, you have to be careful about over-interpreting this data, because they get married young there also. So a fair amount of this is marital teen birth rate. And again, the data isn't readily available, at least I haven't been able to find it, on what you're worried about or you think you're worried about is the unmarried teen birth rate. Now a lot of people, some are married about teen birth rate, period, because it means people are not getting it, the teenagers are not getting education and so forth. But like most other things, that the social practices in the more conservative regions of the country lead to a lower age of when people have births, and that's not surprising at all. Okay. Okay, now I want to expand this internationally a little bit. So we've talked about America. And here is the country, and this is teenagers, and it's who have ever had sex, two different columns. And one column is male and one column is female, and I cut off by mistake which sex it was. So is it obvious which sex is which here? What? The left column, you'll notice, is consistently larger than the right column. So it should be pretty easy to figure out which is male and which is female. What? Male is on the left. How many people agree with that? How many people think it's going to be the opposite? And why do you think it's going to be the opposite?
Because women are going to consistently get married and have sex, whereas men in a polygamy society might have to wait longer.
Right. Exactly right. So here it is. The first column is indeed women. So you see now the point is very different considerations come in. And this is all an effect of age at marriage. And so here is the complete graph as it was published. And notice the fraction of teenage men that are in union, almost none. Right? Remember, we talked about that the old men keep the young guys from getting married. And these, about 25% across the countries, are in union with men who are older. And therefore, they've had more sex than the young males have not had the opportunity to have sex. So this is part of what I've described before about the power structure and the money structure, that the old men keep the young men in kind of a state of frustration. And the females have sex earlier. Okay. Now, you can look at different countries, and a lot of people, again, this is this discussion of sexuality is very often tied in with ideas of religious morals. And you can look at Ireland, you can look at religion, you can look around the world at countries that have different religions. And one of the most Catholic countries is Ireland, and more than half of all babies are born to mothers under 25, so they have a low age of birth. And about half of those are born outside of marriage. So if half your babies are born before you're 25 and half of those are illegitimate, that means that all the babies, just from the young women having babies, that's 25% of your total babies are illegitimate. When you add in the illegitimacy of children born to women over 25, then that the Irish rate comes to equal or exceed the US rate of about 1/3. And if you compare the Irish illegitimacy rate to white American women, which is in some sense the proper comparison group, the Irish rate's way higher, about 50% higher than the American rate. Now you go to the other side. New Zealand is an old-fashioned Protestant country. It has a very retro feeling when you visit it. You've been there, yes. And 38% of all births in New Zealand are out of wedlock. In England, it's nearly 40% of births, and they have the same problem. A third of marriages end in divorce, and ever-increasing numbers of people see marriage as just an irrelevant thing and don't bother. In Japan, I think I gave you these things. The 26% of first births are to women who conceive before marriage. And in Japan, I guess I mentioned this before, they have such a high rate of abortion that you can't tell very much from the actual childbirth rates. Okay, we're coming to the end. We are at the end. And there's lots more to say. Let me tell you one more thing. So the whole pattern of childbearing is changing drastically, especially in poor communities. So it's very difficult for poor people to bring up children because they just have no money. And so you look, what's happening is, who actually brings up, say, largely black children in America? Is it the mothers? The grandmother, very common pattern. I don't know if it's that the grandmothers are bringing up the children. And we get the white dominant group gets upset by this, but actually it's a split between the biological act of parenting and the psychological and economic act of parenting. The kids get pregnant quite young, but they're probably biologically very capable of pregnancy at the ages at which they get pregnant. So in some sense, from a biological point of view, getting pregnant in your late teenage may be a biological optimum, but they are not psychologically prepared to be a parent, and they're not economically prepared to be a parent. Who is most stable psychologically is probably the mother's mother, the grandmother, who will be 35 or 40 at a time when you're sort of more or less emotionally stable, you haven't gotten into old age yet, and whatever degree of economic stability you're going to have, which is never going to be very great, is strongest at that age. So in a sense, it's a very rational kind of split that you do in your life cycle. You do your biological reproduction at the age when you're most capable of that, and at a later stage when you're most psychologically and economically capable, you do your psychological and economic parenting. And there's also this, and because of that, there's been big debates in America about welfare. Does welfare encourage illegitimate births? And they go in the public rolls, and this is especially done either openly or covertly, always referring to poor people and often to minority people. Well, if you actually look at the economics, the amount that women get on welfare is really very small. Where is the major, and not enough to allow you to stay alive and bring up your child. Where's the economic sustenance coming from? It's coming from the grandmother. It's the grandmother, the young girl, and certainly the baby will often live with the grandmother. She pays the rent, she has a job. That the welfare is not coming from the government, that's a small amount. The welfare is coming from the grandmother. So there is welfare involved, but it's within the family kind of welfare. And it's really this system of having the grandmother take care of the kids and economically support the kids that is what enables a large degree of unwed teen pregnancy in poor and minority communities. Okay, we will So from that lecture, we'll go on to abortion next time.